undisputed king of stars.
Welcome to Jack Henneman. He is the host of a great history podcast called History of the Americans. Before we really get into it, what is presentism?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor. I enjoy your podcast. Presentism is the application of today's values, morality, assumptions to, in the way I use it, the judgment of people, decisions, and things in the past. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously a very big topic. It's related to things historians talk about, like anachronism, which is a very similar idea. But I think that it obscures rather than illuminates the past. And I think its widespread use is obviously to be avoided. I certainly avoid it.
Right. And that's one thing that's really good about your podcast. We don't have today's political issues or the scandal of the week, which changes so quickly, entering into your discussion about Sir Francis Drake, praise be unto him, or any of the other great people and just fascinating people, some awful people who are inhabiting the world of the very earliest stages of colonization, whether it's with France, Spain, or England. So how did you get the idea for this podcast? You kind of had one of the first biggie podcasts was Mike Duncan did History of Rome, and he just, I don't know, went in his closet and got a microphone set up and started talking about everything Rome. Where did you see the need for one about the Americans? Because I don't know, I think your concept of how you're covering the history of the Americans is really interesting, because otherwise it would be very confusing, kind of limiting it to the current United States.
Yeah, so it didn't really start with a particular mission, a desire for podcaster glory or anything like that. It was in September of 2020, I live in Austin, Texas, and in September of 2020, when the virus was sort of at a low point, I swabbed up and I wanted to go visit my mother in Charlottesville, Virginia. So I took a test and sort of drove to Charlottesville, being careful until I at least got to her. And then having accomplished that, not having seen her in 9 months, I embarked on a sort of 3-week solo drive about in pandemic America. And
it's like Cormac McCarthy's The Road out there.
It was a little bit, yeah. And I would sort of report this on Facebook and whatnot, and to my friends, not some big following. And law school roommate, I was also saying I was listening to podcasts and and a law school roommate turned me on to David Crowther's History of England podcast, which has been around about a dozen years. He's sort of 400 episodes in-ish, and he's actually only in the 1630s himself. But I started listening to that, and I probably listened to 30 or 40 episodes, and I began to wonder whether anyone had done anything comparable for the U.S. And parallel to that, I had this sort of my father was professor of history, medievalist, but I'd had this sort of long-standing ambition to read American history in a really organized way. I think, like a lot of people who like history, I've read my way around it, bits and pieces, but I didn't have a coherent model in my own mind that I was happy with. And so I sort of decided to do that, and that the podcast would be a really good forcing function rather than, me getting bored and picking up a detective novel or something. I would stay on it. And that, in fact, turned out to be the case. I came back and I spent a couple of months, reading, and mostly a lot of it learning how to do a podcast. I'm kind of an old guy. This is all do it myself. And then I launched the first episode, which was an introduction, on January 1st, 2021. And I'm about 112 episodes in. and it's been great. It got picked up. I got some help from some friends of mine who've got Twitter followings. Iowa Hawk is one of them.
Yeah.
We've known each other online for about 15 years.
Oh, great.
I had a blog, which I'm not going to mention, under a pseudonym, and he liked that, and I liked his. We got to know each other that way. And then he has since moved to Austin, rather famously, and for those who follow him, and we're now quite good friends. So anyway, he gave me a little boost, and then a whole bunch of other people picked it up, and I was off to the races. And now I've got the pressure audience and people who expect to hear something new fairly often, and but it's very energizing. So
yeah, and it seems good too, because like you say, I started this off. It's something that you mention every few episodes. At the intro, you'll just kind of saying, we don't use presentism here, and here's basically what it is and why we don't use it. And I'm always kind of nervous going into any kind of informational, apolitical podcast that I'm going to be drawn to, especially, history podcasts. I want to forget about the modern world and the modern age and think, oh, wow, what was it like back in the days of the Assyrians or early England or something like that. I don't want to be reminded about, oh, okay, and Greta Thunberg said this, and this celebrity just dumped that celebrity, so let's go on a tangent about that. But just kind of tell it as a story, as the best we can do. We're obviously, if you have 5 people writing diaries about what's going on in Jamestown, say, they're going to be totally different perspectives, but you just try as best you can to say, hey, here are basically the facts, here's what's happening. And I also too, like, you get to see the personalities of, okay, this guy, every time he writes back home to the court, all he does is puff himself up and rag on this other person. And it's like, oh, wow, yeah, we're all just like them in a way. Really, that's probably how I would act under extreme circumstances. So it's just a lot of fun to learn about these people.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the 15 and 1600s, and I'm still meandering away. I'm somewhere between 1635 and 1645 in my timeline. But one of the things about it is, on the one hand, these are people who approached everything from a really post-medieval frame of reference. Almost to the last person, they were deeply religious. This was something they believed. Mm-hmm. Religion was not a cynical excuse for something they did. When they didn't understand, for example, to pick one gruesome thing, they didn't understand that the old world diseases were killing the Indians and not them for complex reasons of immunity. They understood it as providential. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't cynical. That was a true belief that happened to have fed an attitude about the indigenous peoples that was ultimately terrible to them,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, exactly. Just not understanding all the modern disease theories and things like that, but they are in this crazy new world. If you go down south, like Pizarro encountering a llama, going, what kind of a demon is this animal? I've never seen such a crazy looking thing in my life. And then meanwhile, the natives all over the place, when they first encounter these people, are just like, what are these weirdos? Why are they stealing why are they tromping through my pumpkin patch right now? And what's that huge wooden island that they just swam away from? So for some reason, I love all sorts of history podcasts, books on it. But for American history, I think my favorite since I was really young has been kind of this early encounter period, the colonial period, because it's just so crazy to think about coming from one side, coming onto a new world, and for the other side, to see this new group of creatures who you've never really had contact with, unless you count the Vikings, and just how the heck would either side react to that kind of a crazy occurrence?
Yeah, and it's, one of the things that if you sort of read the early descriptions, one of the things you realize that maybe you didn't quite take in school, at least if you're sort of our age, as opposed to much younger.
I'm only 29, as anybody can clearly see, so I'm not sure what you're insinuating there, sir. But
maybe you had a rough pandemic.
yeah, had a rough bout there.
But one of the things you see is how variable in their reactions to Europeans were the various tribes that they came into contact with, and that variability was not just sort of between, say, Incas and Algonquin. It was among Algonquin tribes,
Right.
and you realize that these entities had different leadership, different assumptions, different security concerns of their own, and their responses were fantastically complex and often extremely smart. I mean, the indigenous peoples, the Western Hemisphere, basically, fought a 400-year resistance after Columbus. And it's astonishing to think that given the technological disparities and everything else, they were able to, and the tremendous disadvantage of having these huge population reductions when they encountered old world disease for the first time, and then they backtrack and rebuild. It's really remarkable. And I think that it's important to really think, as you suggest, as you say, what are these people thinking in these moments? It's remarkable. It's fascinating.
Right. And it is kind of interesting too, because you'll have in some cases where, tribe means well, wiped out, no questions asked. Another one pretends to be a nice tribe and then wipes out this scraggling group of settlers. But what I love is the outsmarting, something that you had talked about, and we talked about Coronado. I live in Arizona, and I remember telling my daughters when they were younger the story, because we have to be driving up the highway that kind of roughly approximates Coronado's journey through Arizona. And every time he encountered Indians, he's just like, he's all armed, he's armored, he's ready for action, he's ready to kick some butt. And he was like, we heard there was gold here. And all the Indians said, oh, the gold, that's right. Just keep going north. I don't know, 100 miles, tons of gold. Yeah, this tribe we don't much like. Yeah, just take them out. Then they would go up 100 miles north, and then it was like that tribe would go, oh, sure, gold. Yeah, plenty of it. Just keep going. Just keep going north. And by the end, he was on this wild goose chase running around Kansas or something, and had nothing to show for it. So there's a lot of shrewdness going on people just seeing these strange metal-clad figures who they don't much trust, and just how they kind of adapt to the group and see, okay, how can we use these European settlers as much as they want to use us?
Yeah, I mean, when Hernando de Soto and his Entrada
He's
landed
a charming
in Florida,
fellow.
well, he had his moments, but certainly can't defend what he did in any kind of modern terms, probably even contemporaneous terms. He was definitely a harsh guy, but he the tribes in Florida and in the Southeast would send him on. Oh no, we don't have any gold, but those guys over there, who we're not going to mention have been our enemies for the last 100 years, they've got a lot of it, and so you're exactly right. And of course, the super fascinating historical mystery surrounds this fellow who was originally named Paco Cunha. He was picked up by the Spanish in I think in the 1560s, and in the area of the Chesapeake, really near where Jamestown is. And he is sort of kidnapped, brought to Spain, learns Spanish within months, and apparently is personally charismatic, talks Philip II, who's literally the most powerful person, not only in the European world, but probably the entire world at that point, into, sending him back to Virginia. Well, that wasn't, as I sort of said in one of the episodes, that wasn't a matter of, I'll call you an Uber, right? I mean, you had to, put together a major transatlantic expedition where people might die. And he takes years to get back. And then there's some evidence that he turns out to be this fellow, Macantana, who led the resistance against the Jamestown settlers years later. And there's debate about that. It's fast, but nobody knows for sure.
Right.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, definitely. It's wild to think about. Now, we need to talk about a personal favorite of yours and myself, Francis Drake, the famed discoverer of California. Once and for all, you've said you've settled that. No, but this guy's life was just, again, it's one of those things you submit it as a script to Hollywood. They're like, this is stupid. There's nobody who could have done all this crazy, crazy stuff. What attracts you to Francis Drake and all his adventures and daring do and close scrapes?
Well, as I sort of say in the tagline for the podcast, it's about the history of the lands that now add up to today's United States. So it's my own arbitrary boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And, Drake touched the United States at various critical points on his famous voyage, as it's called, the circumnavigation. He spent between 5 and 10 weeks in the summer of 1579, somewhere on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
For a very long time, it was thought to be in the Bay Area. And really, there's been a lot of evidence marshaled, I believe entirely convincing evidence that it was more like the Oregon coast. But in any case, he recorded all sorts of ethnographic information about the Indians there, and miraculously never got in any scrapes with them. It's really the only such early encounter in North America where the Europeans landed, spent a meaningful amount of time, and didn't end up shooting war with Indians. He also landed at the Roanoke colony, the first one in 1586, and picked up the survivors there and brought them back to England. And there's a bunch of controversy around that. But, so that's the sort of touches in the U.S. But I think the critical point is that Drake was so wildly successful as a privateer, first a pirate, then a privateer, as early as 1573, that there was this whole sort of, he sort of led to a vast English proxy war, privateering war against Spain. Mm-hmm. So long before Spain and England, Spain being the dominant Catholic power trying to extinguish Protestantism, England being a weak country, but yet the most powerful Protestant country. Mm-hmm. Long before they fell into war in 1588, the famous Spanish Armada, Drake and his sort of copycats were torturing the Spanish across the line in the Western Hemisphere. And then, having eventually provoked Philip II into going to war with England, he did more than anyone else to, ensure that the English won that war. And there are Drake detractors who argue to the contrary and all the rest. But in a long discussion, I feel like I could make the argument fairly strongly that he did that. Well, if England doesn't win that war, if Philip II, takes out Elizabeth and installs a Catholic on the throne in England, English settlement of North America happens in an entirely different way if it happens at all, and so I view with a sort of, butterfly effect, Drake's actions were incredibly important. And then once I got into the story, it turned out to be like such a great story that I probably told quite a bit more of it than was absolutely necessary to the mission of the podcast. And then I got so much positive support, I started joking about Drake, finding ways to mention him 50 years after the fact. So
yeah, exactly. Well, I had learned as a kid, growing up here in Arizona, that he the Drake's Bay, right, the Bay Area, and he was kind of at least the English discoverer of California, and it was just always sold to me as a done deal. Now, one thing that I think you should devote a minimum of 20 episodes to. I'm of Finnish descent, and New Sweden was formed kind of around New Jersey at some point, and they basically wanted to get rid of some troublesome Finns, so they had to send a bunch of Finns out there, and that's why the entire eastern seaboard is now controlled by Finland. So I don't know how long those poor saps made it, maybe 10 years or something like that, but it's just really amazing at the point you're at now, like the 1600s, just to go into the bravery or the desperation or the idiocy of some of these colonists. Just how desperate do you need to be to, it's kind of like, I don't know, a Heinlein, the moon is a harsh mistress kind of a thing. It's just like, yeah, I don't have any chance down here. I'm going to go to the moon and hopefully I'll survive and hopefully I can have kids. But it's just amazing to look at these people and wonder what the heck did they have that, I don't know, I'm too lazy to go to Safeway sometimes.
Well, they're really very different things, right? So the Spanish in Florida and the Southwest, in Florida, they were largely there for military reasons. And most of the people in St. Augustine for a very long time were just garrison soldiers and people there to support them. They didn't have real families in quantities of farming and trying to build a settlement. In the Southwest, there was more of that. But there, it was driven heavily by the aspirations of Jesuits and other orders to Christianize the population. And they built missions and they did all this stuff that was, very much putting down roots, and there were settlers and everything else. But, again, an awful lot of that was not driven by the huge opportunities, the desire for souls. And then in the English Eastern Seaboard, you really had at least two really different models, right? Virginia was wildly different from New England. In New England, they were sort of religious refugees and did not aspire to building vast fortunes. Mm-hmm. Eventually they would, but they didn't early on. They were trying to build a city of God of their own, not necessarily doing a lot of conversion, although they paid lip service to that. In Virginia, you had, essentially merchant adventurers, and they hired people, essentially these indentured servants, and took them over. And the whole thing would have been a catastrophe economically, but for the learning to cultivate West Indies tobacco in the Chesapeake, and that changed the game entirely.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, how much of your time, I've actually gone back and forth with the missus a couple times, like, boy, I love listening to history podcasts. I should start one. And I'm trying to find like a niche. And I'm like, no. And then I kind of considered all the reading I'd need to do. I already do a lot of reading. I love reading, but boy, you must spend a lot of time just pouring through books and doing research on these things, because you want to be as accurate as possible. You don't want to have to go back and make corrections, but boy, you just must spend a ton of time just doing the research and reading phase.
I do, but I've gotten better at figuring out where to go for the right sources, and then I can I can often get a number of episodes out of a, you know, relatively small amount of reading. Like I did read, I think 5 or 6 books on the first 20 years at Jamestown, I think 6. None of them were doorstops because the documentation that survives just doesn't support a doorstop. But having done that, I think did like 15 episodes, the English on the Chesapeake. So, once I've done that, I've got a lot of raw material, and I read parts of lots of things. So I have all sorts of books that I've read 50 pages of. And then finally, I'm fortunate to have access to all of these academic databases through my alma mater's library as an alumnus. And so I've gotten pretty good about digging into JSTOR and some of the other databases, and finding niche articles on cool topics. And sometimes one journal article can lead to a pretty cool episode. So
right, definitely. Yeah, and sometimes you'll do these sidebar episodes where you can kind of go off the trail a little bit, dig into a subject, whether it's Francis Drake or something else, because there's so many other interesting things going on in that world. It's almost it's amazing how much is going on, and you're restricting yourself to what's considered, the United States today. And there's just so much going on. You have Spain in one part, France in another part, England in another part, interlopers throughout. So it's been a lot of fun to listen to. I highly recommend everybody listen to History of the Americans podcast. Where can people find your show and find you, sir?
Well, they can find the show. It's called The History of the Americans by Jack Henneman. It's on all the podcatchers, Apple, Spotify, etc. I have a website, which is thehistoryoftheamericans.com. And anyone can send me an email at thehistoryoftheamericans@gmail.com. And I'm pretty easy to find on Twitter. So
right. All right. Well, everybody follow him everywhere. Listen to the show. It's great. Jack, thanks so much for spending time. Really appreciate it. And thanks very much for your show. I really enjoyed getting up to the early 1600s where we are, and look forward to moving forward.
Thank you very much for having me.